After experiencing several decades of stability under the Almoravids, the prominent southern cities of Al-Andalus were once again vulnerable to the threat of the Christian Reconquista by the middle of the 12th century. But in their place, another Berber Muslim group by the name of the Almohads rose to power in Morocco and looked to emulate their Almoravid predecessors by conquering Al-Andalus. The fate of Al-Andalus was now left to them. Standing in their way were the Iberian Christian Kingdoms, who with each generation were becoming more ambitious and more bolder. But the energetic and ferocious Almohads proved to be a worthy foe, putting a stop to the momentum of the Reconquista, even if it was just temporary. In the same way that the Almoravid movement was initiated by a Berber theologian from the south of Morocco, the Almohads had a similar origin story. Muhammad ibn Tumart had returned to the Maghreb in around 1117, after pursuing his religious studies in Baghdad, where he came under the influence of the great theologian Al-Ghazali. Returning home with a stricter and more doctrinaire perspective on religious matters, Ibn Tumart proclaimed himself the Mahdi and revolted against the ruling Almoravids for their perceived religious laxity. Although he died in 1130, his Almohad movement would eventually topple the Almoravids in 1147, under the leadership of Ibn Tumart's lieutenant Abd al-Mumin. Unlike their Almoravid predecessors, the Almohads proclaimed the establishment of their own Khilafah. Thereby its rulers could claim to be Khalifs. The decay of Almoravid power in the mid-1140s left Al-Andalus vulnerable to Christian attacks. This vulnerability was compounded by the fact that for the first time, the Christian kingdoms were able to coordinate large-scale attacks on frontier cities and beyond. Santarém, Tortosa, Fraga, and Lisbon were all lost in the years 1147 to 1149. The Christians even felt emboldened enough to besiege the southern coastal city of Almeria, way past the frontier. The forces of Navarre, Castile, and Aragon were propped up by the Genoese navy, and the city was forced to capitulate in 1147. Although Almeria would be regained a decade later by the Muslims, it just goes to show how vulnerable Al-Andalus was in this period. Even before their formal accession to imperial authority in 1147, the Almohads started to get involved in the politics of Al-Andalus. In 1145, a number of Almoravid officials in Iberia saw that their masters were on their way out, and subsequently decided to defect to the Almohads. In 1147, Khalif Abd al-Mumin sent out a force to southeastern Iberia to formally annex Al-Andalus. Starting out with the city of Algeciras, the Almohad forces moved westward all the way to the Algarve. Seville was forced to surrender the following year after a lengthy siege. After dealing with a serious rebellion in their African territories towards the end of the 1140s, the Almohads resumed their expansionist policy in Al-Andalus. Cordoba was saved from the threat of Castile when it came under Almohad control in 1149. Granada held out until 1155 under the leadership of the Banu Ghaniya. The 1150s saw Abd al-Mumin cultivate his imperial ambition eastward into North Africa, going as far as Tunis and Tripoli. This meant he never actually campaigned in Iberia during his reign. In 1163, he was organizing a major expedition to Al-Andalus that he would lead in person, but old age caught up with him and he died before the expedition could take place. Abd al-Mumin had worked hard to turn the Almohad movement into a hereditary dynasty, and thus he was succeeded by his son Abu Ya'qub Yusuf, or Yusuf I. Yusuf did have some political experience by the time he came to the throne, but he seemed to lack the military leadership exhibited by his late father. Instead, he seemed to have been more of a bibliophile in temperament and was more interested in intellectual affairs. A major book collector, Yusuf gathered prominent scholars of the time around him, such as Ibn Tufail and Ibn Rushd. Luckily for the new Caliph, there had been a recent split within the Christian camp. The death of Alfonso VII in 1157 led to a redivision of the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Leon. This would serve the Almohads as the two kingdoms would compete with each other, and they could therefore take advantage of this rivalry amongst the Christians. This was on display in 1170 when the Almohads approached Fernando II of Leon to help them against his own father-in-law, Alfonso I of Portugal. The Portuguese were making significant headway in the region around Badajoz, but Fernando wanted these gains for himself. The joint Muslim-Christian coalition would force Alfonso to retreat. Nevertheless, the main concern for the Almohads in Iberia during the 1160s was not the Christian kingdoms, but a Muslim ruler known as the Wolf King, El Rey Lobo. Ibn Mardanish was an independent Muslim ruler in the Levante region of Iberia who stubbornly clung on to power. Ruling from his capital at Murcia, his realm stretched across the Sharq al-Andalus region, known in English as Eastern Al-Andalus. He was aided by his father-in-law, Ibn Hamushk of Jaén, who even captured Granada from the Almohads in 1162. By the beginning of the 1170s, however, rising discontent from within Ibn Mardanish's realm, partly due to him relying increasingly on Christian support, resulted in him losing key supporters who defected to the Almohads. Ibn Mardanish's death from natural causes in 1172 brought all of mainland Al-Andalus under Almohad authority. In line with Almohad tradition, Ibn Mardanish's family was incorporated into the government and given jobs. Despite the Almohads bringing some much needed stability to the major cities, Al-Andalus continued to be vulnerable to Christian aggression whenever the Caliph was not on the peninsula. So in 1171, Caliph Yusuf crossed into Iberia with a huge army. Although he would stay in his Andalusian capital of Seville for the next 5 years, the Caliph achieved very little. Military activity was largely limited to raids and counter-raids. The Almohads seemed to have found it very difficult to garrison threatened outposts and just generally struggled to organize defensive warfare along the frontier. The Caliph's departure in 1176 for his capital at Marrakesh naturally brought about a sense of foreboding across Al-Andalus of impending Christian aggression. 8 years later, in 1184, the Caliph returned and marched to the western frontier with Portugal. Besieging the city of Santarém on the banks of the Tagus River, the Almohads initially made headway, but the Caliph had made a habit out of proving to be indecisive at important junctures during campaigns. So when he heard reports that Christian reinforcements from Leon were coming to relieve the siege, he was unnerved and called for a retreat. In the ensuing confusion, the Caliph was wounded and died of his wounds a few days later. The mantle of power was taken by his son Ya'qub al-Mansur, who unlike his father exhibited the trait of a capable military leader. The new Caliph was initially preoccupied with revolts in his Maghrebi territories, so Al-Andalus was once again put on the back burner. The revolts in Africa were spearheaded by the Banu Ghaniya family, which still resiliently held out against the Almohads in Majorca in the Balearic Islands. Having somewhat neutralized the danger of the revolt for the time being, the Caliph could turn his attention to Al-Andalus in 1190. The Caliph's campaign resulted in the recapture of Silves and the place of his father's death, Santarém, from the Portuguese. Santarém's fortifications were demolished once they took over it, showing that the Almohads did not intend on holding it, a fact that speaks volumes about their military capability. It is interesting to note that inhabitants of frontier settlements sometimes had to be paid by the Caliph to stay there. This means that oftentimes frontier towns were not economically viable and had to be supported with grants from other parts of the empire, such as Seville. But this policy was not sustainable, especially during times of hardship elsewhere, thereby making the conquest of Muslim frontier towns an alluring and achievable task for the Christians. In 1195, Caliph Ya'qub al-Mansur arrived on the peninsula again. This campaign would mark the zenith of Almohad power in Iberia. Hearing of the Caliph's arrival, the King of Castile, Alfonso VIII, marched south to challenge him. Instead of waiting for his Leonese allies, Alfonso met the Caliph on the battlefield at Al-Andalus in central Spain. The Castilian field army was destroyed, and the Muslims had won a decisive victory in open field for the first time in a long time. Typically, Almohad military success was undermined by the lack of supplies on their campaigns. They seemed to have been too underdeveloped as a state to maintain long supply trains. But at Al-Andalus, the battle happened pretty soon after the Caliph set out on his expedition, so supplies had been fresh. In addition, the battle took place in open country, as opposed to a lengthy siege. Al-Andalus enforced a key lesson on the Christians. As long as they didn't meet the Almohads in open field, the advantage lay decisively with them. Caliph Ya'qub al-Mansur wanted to build on the momentum of the victory and campaigned yearly for the next 2 years, in the process reclaiming several small towns and fortresses along the frontier. These successes earned him truces with the major Christian kingdoms. So when he died in 1198, his son and successor Muhammad al-Nasir inherited an Al-Andalus which was relatively stable for the time being. In North Africa, the Banu Ghaniya were still proving to be a major nuisance to the Almohads. They were taking more and more territory in Ifriqiya. So in 1203, the Almohads decided to strike at their base in Majorca and finally took control of all the Balearic Islands. Whilst the first decade of the 13th century seemed to have been relatively peaceful in Iberia, the Almohads' grip on the Maghreb was rapidly loosening. By 1209, they could only exercise real control of territories only as far east as Tlemcen. At roughly this time, the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon began agitating for war. To compound matters, the Kingdom of Leon, a traditional ally of the Almohads, was threatened by the Pope with ecclesiastical sanctions if they attacked their Christian brethren in Castile. The Caliph began receiving reports of increased Christian raids into Muslim territories, and so in 1211 he arrived in Iberia. The following year in 1212, the old Castilian king, Alfonso, determined to right the wrong of Al-Andalus, marched at the head of a large army which had contingents from all over Christian Iberia and even Crusader forces from beyond. The two sides met near Jaén in southern Spain, and what ensued was a massive defeat for the Muslims at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. Lack of supplies meant that the Christian army soon had to withdraw from the south. but the damage the loss did to Almohad prestige was significant. The battle is often seen as being an important turning point in the Reconquista, which facilitated the lightning-quick conquests of the 1230s and 1240s. After his disastrous defeat, Khalif al-Nasir fled back to Marrakesh, where he was assassinated the very next year in 1213. He was succeeded by his infant son, Yusuf II, whose mother happened to be a Christian. Despite the victory at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa and the youth of the new Almohad leader, the Christians could not press their advantage home. This was due to their own internal issues. Portugal, Castile, and Aragon were all ruled by adolescent kings. Therefore, they were more interested in maintaining the stability of their own realms. As such, things remained relatively stable in Al-Andalus. The young Khalif's advisors even signed a truce with Castile. Things began to take a more chaotic turn when Khalif Yusuf II died in 1224, apparently gored by one of his cows. He left no sons behind, and the ensuing succession crisis would bring about the downfall of the empire. Up until this point, the Almohad ruling family had largely remained united. But after 1224, the dynasty was consumed by internecine conflict. The throne switched hands every year or so. In 1228, the Almohad claimant in Seville, Al-Mamun, left Iberia to stake his claim to the throne in Marrakesh. And with his departure, Almohad power in Iberia came to an end. Al-Andalus was now a sitting duck for the Christian kingdoms. Their energetic rulers would go on to become legends of the Reconquista. Over the next 2 decades, Cordoba, Seville, Valencia, Badajoz, and many more major cities fell to the Christians. Only Granada was left to continue the legacy of Al-Andalus. As usual, I want to thank my Patreons for their generous support. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. And let me know what you guys think of my maps. I just started getting into making them, so if you got any tips about what could make them better, etc., comment down below. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe if you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, peace!